For my first YouTube video, I wanted to discuss why I am so skeptical of religion. And for the longest time I wasn't able to do this because I couldn't exactly figure out why I was so skeptical of religion at first. It just seemed that I didn't buy into any of the dogma or any of the superstitions that seemed to go with it. I just seemed to know for the longest time, ever since I seemed to be born, as far back as I could remember, that I was always skeptical of religion. It didn't occur to me until just recently why that was. And the reason it took me so long to figure out why I was so skeptical had absolutely nothing to do with religion. It went all the way back to when I was very young, at least younger than 3, and my parents would always go camping, and being a rambunctious little child, I could never really stand still in the car long enough to really, I guess my movements would wear on their patience, and so they'd hand me the maps and the atlases so that I would sit there and stare at them and be quiet. And I was always fascinated with maps when I was a little kid. I always stared there and tried to figure out how they knew where things were and how these little road symbols, what they all meant, and it was kind of all new to me. And I was told that I could trust maps, and that maps could help me, guide me. They could, basically point you in the right direction and whatnot. And so I was pretty into maps for a long time because to me it felt like they were the best thing to truth, that people tried to absolutely get things right. And I was always wanting to know what was the best truth, I guess there was. I was obsessed about knowing right from wrong, and even though my parents had done nothing, by staring at these maps with the young mind that I had, well younger than 3, I remind you, I reached my own conclusion that the world was flat, because the maps were accurate representation of the world. They could predict where things were. They knew how to get to places. They pretty much guided all our road trips. And yet it occurred to me that if the maps had to be absolutely true, and they were a true representation of the world, then if the maps were flat, then the world had to be flat. And of course, when I revealed this insight to my parents, they of course flipped out, and they had to sit me down and explain to me that just because the maps were flat and they could predict where things are in the real world, that doesn't mean the world is flat. In fact, they had to explain to me a more deeper fundamental part of truth, that the map is only a symbol, a symbolic representation of the world. It could never be the absolute truth, because the world was round, and therefore it could never fit on a flat piece of paper. And this really blew my mind. As a little child, I took a map of the world and I put the ends together and realized that they were telling the truth, that the ends matched up, and the world was in fact circular. That was world-bending to me, but at the time it had absolutely nothing to do with religion, and so it took me forever to figure out that why I was so skeptical of religion was because of maps. And that just because something's on paper, not only does it mean it's not true, that it can never be true. It's only symbolic. Which says something deeply profound about people who take the absolute word of God or the Bible as anything that could be inherently true or never false. And it's mind-blowing to me that even when I was very young, people would hand me, I remember very vividly my aunts and uncles who would try to influence me with their religion, they'd hand me a Bible and say, this is the absolute truth. And right then and there, a little red flag went up in my mind and said, no, that can't be true. It is purely symbolic. It could never be true, no matter how bad it wanted to be. The only thing that can be absolutely true at all times is the very reality itself, meaning that if the Bible was the absolute truth of the universe, it would have to be a mini representation of the entire universe, which it obviously can't because of its limitations. The basic fact that it's on paper, like a map cannot tell you how high mountains are or exactly where trees grow, the Bible could never, ever be a representation of reality. It just can't. And when I talk about symbolic, I'm talking about concepts that you at least have to have some understanding of them before they have any meaning. Like when Jesus rode into town on a donkey, you have to at least have some idea of what a donkey is for that to have any meaning to you whatsoever. When you see the word donkey, your mind literally has to assemble that in your own imagination. Your mind has to understand that a donkey has 4 legs, and has fur, and has the likeness of a horse, and all these features. And your mind does all this on its own. The imagery that compels people to fall to their knees and raise their hands to the sky and and just cry and weep at these stories is basically just all going on inside their head. There is nothing to it that their mind is not putting into effect. They're merely taking the representation and trying to make an emotional story out of what is basically scribblings on paper. And that's what it means to be symbolic. It's only what your mind can imagine it to be. And that's the limitations of anything that's on paper or anything that your mind perceives. It's second-hand information. You didn't write the Bible. You're reading someone else's writings and trying to reconstruct in your mind that world that they brought to you. And maps are very much the same case. They are merely a representation of reality. They couldn't possibly be the absolute truth. There's nothing that can be the absolute truth. And it might be the case that no one has the absolute truth. But that doesn't mean one gets to redefine reality willy-nilly to fit their religious beliefs. And this is why I am skeptical of religion. My parents inadvertently vaccinated me against all religious dogma and doctrine without realizing it. And that's my story on how I basically was started on the path to atheism. Mental out.